Hello Lorcana YouTube community and all my fellow Sapphire and Steel players. I want to start this video off by saying thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel recently. It definitely means a lot and I promise to keep pushing and creating new Lorcana content. So recently, I've had people reach out to me and tell me how much fun they've had using these different Sapphire Steel lists that I've uploaded online. But the one question I keep getting is, which list should I take to my local store set championships to try and take it down and win the whole thing? And that's a good question. And the cool thing about store championships is since it's at your locals, you can pretty much have certain tech cards and certain slots to tailor to your local meta. So, for example, at my locals, I have a lot of Amber Steel and a lot of Amethyst decks. Maybe your locals has a lot of Ruby decks. So, I thought it was a good idea to create 5 Sapphire and Steel lists, and they're all different. They have each unique strategies, and all of them have really good matchups, and some have bad matchups. So, depending on your locals, you might be more inclined to take this certain list over a different one. I thought putting all 5 lists in one video was the best way to get all the Sapphire and Steel information you need for your Set A store championships. And I'm going to have timestamps down below so you can always go back and listen to your favorite list. Let me know down in the comments below if you guys want me to make a video talking only about one specific deck. Maybe I can go more into details with the mulligans, strategies, and overall just the card choices for that specific list. If you guys enjoyed the video, please go ahead and hit that like button. Drop a comment down below. Let me know which list was your favorite. And if you guys haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and hit that sub button. So for the first list is going to be my Set 8 version of Popsicle Birds. I actually uploaded this YouTube video and I took down a case tournament set store championship last set, and I absolutely love this list. This deck is very good into steel decks or anything amethyst, and your worst matchup is Ruby Sapphire. The game plan and strategy of this deck is very simple. You want to go all gas, no brakes. You want to have a very aggressive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 play line, turn everything sideways, and when you're on the draw, you have cards like Calhoun, Smee, and Jafar to help you challenge back on the board. And then you have cards like Doc, Namari, and Desperate Plan that you use to close out the game to make sure you get that last pieces that you need to finish out. Alice is the MVP in this deck. Being able to give your characters ward and a steel meta is huge. And you also have Pete to stop action. So having cards like Alice, Pete, and then being able to give cards like Pluto ward. And then to top that off, you have a cards like Cogsworth, which is just insane because you give your whole board resist. It just makes all your opponents' removal pretty much useless against this deck. And since you're curving out very aggressive early, you should be able to finish the game within 7 to 8 turns at least. Again, your worst matchup is Ruby Sapphire just because you have to deal with B preps and Sisus. So that's why we have the locations and Gone 2 to get that lore that we need to end the game. I think 3 copies of Fire of the Cannons is mandatory in all Sapphire and Steel lists right now just because you can shut down Diablos and it's very good into Amber Steel. So you're probably going to see that card in all the lists. I know in a lot of other Kiwi lists, they're not on the Bell Popsicle package, but me personally, I think a turn 1 Bell is super huge in a lot of matchups. And if you have a turn 1 Bell, that's going to help you against a lot of these aggro decks, and a lot of these steel decks are playing something on turn 1. And then you have Simba to help you ditch dead cards or multiple uninkables in your hand. I think Namari and Desperate Plan are very huge upgrades that we got in set 8 for this deck because again, you want to be able to draw your pieces late game, and a card like Namari is huge in your Ruby Sapphire matchup because it cannot get killed by Sisu with all the cards that you can have in your discard. Namari gets +1 attack, so this card is very hard for your opponent to remove. They usually have to waste a Be Prepared on it or attack into it with the Maui, and then she can also one-shot locations. And Desperate Plan is just basically another copy of Doc. Again, this deck is very good into anything low to the ground or steel, so if your locals has pretty much all of that, I definitely recommend taking this list. And just in case there's a couple of Ruby Sapphire players, don't worry, you have the locations and you have the Gone 2 with the Petes to help you in that matchup. For the second list is going to be my set 8 version of Sapphire Steel, A Whole New World. This deck has a very good matchup into Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Amethyst, and Amethyst decks in general. Why? Because about card advantage. You don't have to worry about falling behind in card draw because a card like Whole New World lets you get a whole new 7. Against Ruby Sapphire, you don't have to worry about your opponent getting rid of your board because if you can spam the board and then draw a whole new 7 back to back, eventually your opponent is just not going to have all the tools to be able to remove all your threats. And then you can also get rid of key pieces like Tamatoa, Sisus, and Be Prepared. And then against Amethyst decks, you don't have to worry about your opponent drawing from Friends, Genie, Rabbits, or Finder Keepers because you can get rid of all those cards that they drew and draw yourself a whole new 7. This deck does fall weak to aggro decks just because your game plan is to sing Whole New World on turn 5. And early on, you can fall weak to aggro just because if they do get a lot of lore early on and you give them a whole new 7 cards, it's going to be very hard to answer their threats back to back. So you do have to be careful with that. But that's why we have a very good early defensive strategy with cards like Fire the Cannon, Simba, and the Bell package to combat the aggro decks. And then the game plan is very simple. Just like any other ramp Sapphire and Steel deck, you want to be able to ramp, but instead on ramp on turn 3, we're choosing to ramp on turn 2 with Tipo and Cell, because I think with the Whole New World right now, if you're going to fight the board, you're better off doing it on turn 1. That way you can focus on your main game plan, and that's putting a 5-ink character on your turn 4. And with Cogsworth, Beast, and Namari, those are all very awesome options right now. Cogsworth giving your board resist and having Ward is just the best singer to always guarantee being able to sing a Whole New World. And the awesome thing about this deck is, just in case you don't have to sing Whole New World, you can always fall back to the card draw with Beast and Namari. This deck doesn't rely on having to use Whole New World all 4 copies. The game plan with Sapphire and Steel, with how strong the 5-ink characters are right now in the meta, and if you're able to fight early on with characters like Tala, P, and Bell, you can actually just win the game off using 1 Whole New World. You don't have to use all 4, right? Because if you're able to fight the board early on, get some lore in, that 1 Whole New World will give you the 7 cards you need, that last gas to close out the game. I'm only playing 1 Fishbone Quill just because I don't think Fishbone Quill is just that good of a card anymore without Hiram. So just fully focusing on the consistency on turn 2 ramp, it's just the way to go. But having 1 copy is a super solid against these Ruby/Amethyst decks. Again, your awesome matchups are Ruby Sapphire. Again, I do recommend using this list if your local meta is full of Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Amethyst, or Amethyst decks in general, just because, again, of how much card draw the Whole New World gives you as an advantage, and you have the locations to counter those Ruby decks, and you never have to worry about your Amethyst opponent having more cards than you. And against those aggro decks, just make sure you hard mulligan for your defensive cards early on. For the third deck list is going to be my updated version of Sapphire and Steel items/Crab Rave. This deck has a very good matchup into Ruby Sapphire items and the Shark version, and to any Amethyst decks as well, and pretty much any decks that just like to grind out and try to win in the late game. Your bad matchups are aggro decks, just because our game plan is to win in the late game. So we do have a little bit of defensive tools that we can combat any aggro strategies. But for the most part, against grind decks, that's where we shine the most. And against aggro, again, we do have a few tools that are able to help us not lose and fall behind in lore in the early game. The core strategy is pretty simple. You want to be able to ramp on turn 2, whether with Tipo or Cell, and bring out Scrooge McDuck. And again, against anything evasive, you have Flint to take to answer those threats. And then you want to be able to play Namari just to have a nice body to fight the board and start finding your pieces. And you close out the game by playing items and winning with cards like Tamatoa. The reason why this deck has a good matchup into Ruby Sapphire items and just Ruby Sapphire, Ruby decks in general is because you never really play for the board, only when you have to. You're also going to be in the late game, and you have cards like Workshop and the item package that you're never going to have to worry about falling behind in card advantage. Against the aggro decks, we have cards like Tipo, Fire the Cannons, and Bell to help us stop any early lore bleeding. And if you can just survive the first 3 turns, you should be good to win the late game, just because you're able to spam big crabs and your opponent has to answer them. And against steel decks, it's going to be very hard to do that. Usually, Tamatoa only gets answered with direct removal, like Be Prepared, or a card like Hades. Although this deck did lose. Although Sapphire Steel did lose Hiram and a lot of people thought this deck was dead, Scrooge is just still a very strong card, being able to draw you a card depending on how many items you have, right? Because you get to look at the top 4. We're playing a good amount of items, so Scrooge should consistently be able to find you a card, and then that 4/4 stat line is huge. And once you get Scrooge down against these aggro decks like Amber Steel, you don't have to worry about that 4 willpower, because Scrooge can pretty much one-shot anything. And after Scrooge, you have Namari, and now you have 2 super strong bodies on the board. And Namari is a nice replacement for Hiram, because Namari allows us to draw again and filter out to find these late game pieces, and she helps fight the board a lot with her crazy stat line of having X attack based off all the cards in your discard, and having that 5 willpower stat line Questing for 2 is also huge and just super solid into the Ruby Sapphire matchup. I think this deck list is a super solid pick if your local meta is full of those Ruby Sapphire item, Ruby Sapphire Shark lists, or just Amethyst decks in general. If you have a lot of aggro decks, this would not be a good pick. And against those late game decks, just slam Tomatos down, use Lucky Dime, put workshops out, and you're going to win the late game. For the fourth list is going to be my updated version of Sapphire Steel Hannah Montana. This deck is very good into pretty much every deck in the meta. So if you wanted to take a Sapphire and Steel deck and you didn't care what your opponents were going to be on, I would suggest taking this list. Now, this list in particular is a little bit more on the harder side to pilot. Reason being is because of the playstyle. So what is Hannah Montana? Well, Hannah Montana is a deck archetype that I created with Lorcana Justice last set. The whole point and strategy of this deck is being able to fight the board early on with a no new world approach, but still being able to ramp and get a 5-drop character on turn 4. I liked having that early game strategy and being able to fight the board offensive and defensively, meaning you get a very nice on the draw game plan. And just before you run out of cards, you have cards like Namari and Beast to be able to refill your hand, and then you have a card like Dog to help you close out the game. But I was having trouble against these Ruby Sapphire or Amethyst decks in general because sometimes these 1-2 cards that I'm drawing off these cards wasn't enough. So I wanted to add Whole New World in there to be able to close out those games where I was falling behind and running out of gas. And then you have the locations in for all these Ruby decks. So this strategy in general, being able to fight the board early on, and then you have cards like Whole New World and the locations against these Ruby / Amethyst decks, it's just super awesome and makes this deck very peak Sapphire Steel toolbox. The core strategy of the deck is very simple. You have cards like Simba, Tipo, Fire the Cannons, and Bell to fight the board early on. You always want to ramp on turn 2 in this deck just because I felt like on turn 3 you fall behind, and being able to play Flint on turn 3 against evasive cards or Tala to help you to dig is super huge. And then if you're able to get a 5-drop character on turn 4, you're able to control the board, and then you have cards like Dog and New World to help you close out the game. Again, I do want to say this list is one of the more harder ones to pilot just because it's very toolboxy and you have a lot of different lines of plays compared to just having one strategy and always sticking to it. So if you want to test your skills, or again, not care what your opponents were going to be on and just have a good matchup, overall good matchup into everything in the meta, I suggest taking this deck. It's super fun, and shout out JDZ for inspiring me with the name Hannah Montana, because when you add the New World approach and the no New World approach, you get the best of both worlds. You have to save the best one for last. This is going to be what I think is the best Sapphire and Steel list for the set 8 Lorcana meta, and I personally think it's also tier 1. This is going to be my creation, the ramp mid-range Sapphire and Steel list. So for those of you who aren't aware, I uploaded this video a few days ago. I attended a 10K and 15K event here in Texas hosted by PPG, and I took this Sapphire and Steel list and I was able to get 2 top 64 placements back to back. Since then, and since I uploaded the video, I actually made changes to the deck, and these are the changes that you see here. What matchup are good for this deck? Me personally, I think you have a good matchup into every single deck in the meta, and this deck is a better version of Hannah Montana. You just don't rely on Whole New World. This deck is definitely going to be the hardest deck to pilot out of all of these 5 just because it is peak toolbox. The peakest toolbox just because you're playing cards like Doc, Pleakley, Gaston, Namari, and Tinkerbell. You have a good matchup into everything because you fight the board early on with all these awesome defensive tools that we have. On turn 1, you can play Mulan and Simba to help you filter out their cards in your hand. You can open up Fire the Cannons on the blind, and just in case you're going against Ruby Sapphire, you can ditch these dead cards with Simba. And then turn 2, you have cards like Helga to help you fight evasive cards, and then Smee, just an overall super awesome body to fight the board and gain some early lore. And this deck you ramp on turn 3, and the reason why this deck is it's more harder than these other decks is because ramping on 2, it's just always easier than ramping on turn 3. On turn 3, the reason why I like it is just because, again, you like to play on turn 1 and turn 2, so you're always going to have 2 bodies on board. And then on turn 3, you can play a card like Pleakley that allows you to use a weak card like Simba and turn it into ink. And now Pleakley is going to be the strong 3/4 character that you have on the board to help you be on the offense or defensive side of the match. And then you get always are able to bring out a 5-drop character on turn 4. 4 copies of Namari, 4 copies of Beast, 4 copies of Cogsworth. All of these cards are just super useful in this meta right now to be able to fight the board. And the Namari on Beast are going to help you keep drawing cards to never run out of gas. And then you have cards like Tinkerbell that are just super solid into Amethyst decks and Steel decks in general. If you have Cogsworth out with Tinkerbell, she will have resist, and that's going to be even harder for your opponents to get rid of her. And once Tinkerbell comes down, she stuns the board, and your opponents freeze. And all you need is 1 turn to stop your opponent from gaining lore to catch up where you fell behind on the draw. Where I was lacking was a way to close out games against Ruby Sapphire and my previous version of this list. So I actually went up and added 4 copies of the locations just because it's just super solid against Ruby Sapphire. I kept losing at 17-19 lore, so I figured just maxing out on locations if I was going to get Be Prepared or Sisu was the best way to go. And then I also added 2 copies of Gaston. Gaston being able to quest for 3, being a nice curve on your 6 ink is huge, and being able to dig for another dock or another Gaston, maybe a location, is just a nice way to keep finding the gas that you need. And that 3 lore is super huge, and he has a 4/4 stat line, so your opponents, when they trade into him, he's usually a 1-for-1. You have Sail as another alternate ramp strategy, just because I think Sail is a very nice late game card to draw. So being able to Sail on turn 2, and that 1 ink that you can use off Sail, you can use Fire the Cannons, and you can play a 1-drop character. You also don't have to worry about falling behind on board presence, because if you Sail on turn 2, we're playing all these extra copies of Helga and Smee, so we can play 2 bodies on turn 3 after we ramp on turn 2. So on your first 3 turns, you never have to worry about falling behind on board, because you should always have something to fight the board against. And then once you get your Cogsworth, Beast, and Amari down, and you're having that to support your other characters, anything that's not Ruby, the only way to answer that is with like Be Prepared, right? So Be Prepared or Sisu are the only way that your opponents are going to be able to get rid of your board. So you have a good matchup into everything that's not Be Prepared or Sisu. And against those decks, you have the locations, you have the Namaris, you have the Peets, you have the Gastons to help you get the lore that you need to close it out. I also added the 1 copy of Desperate Plan, being a 5th version of Doc, just because I want to be able to never lose at 19 lore to Ruby Sapphire ever. So you have all these key pieces that you need to make sure you don't run out of gas. And the reason again why this deck is very hard to pilot is just because it's very punishing if you make a mistake. If you make 1 mistake, you're going to fall behind, and if you lose border control in the first 1, 2, 3 turns, it's going to be very hard to establish that. So why would I recommend this deck? Because I think it's tier 1. It's the best version, the best deck for Sapphire Steel in set 8. If you wanted to tackle down everything in your local meta and not just have a certain, I only want to tackle this deck, this Sapphire and Steel deck is the way to go. That's it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed these 5 lists and hearing me break down the strategies, the tech choices, the details onto why I picked these certain cards, why these certain lists are good into certain matchups. All of these lists are successful. They're all playable. They're all competitive. I've had success with all these lists personally. I've done all the testing, so you don't have to worry about that. Feel free to reach out to me if you have some extra questions about certain cards, certain tech choices. But again, Sapphire and Steel is absolutely playable. You can definitely win your store championship with it. If you guys enjoyed the video, please go ahead and leave a like, hit that sub button if you haven't, and go ahead and drop a comment down below. Let me know what list was your favorite. Again, if you want me to make a video on 1 list specifically, that way I can go into detail about it, I'll be more than happy to. Also, if you take any of these lists, feel free to @ me on X. That's @CreateTCG. I'd love to see everyone who takes these lists at their store championships. It doesn't matter if you don't win. Let's just see all those Sapphire and Steel lists at all these locals. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.